Austerlitz is rightly called Napoleon's greatest victory, a tactical masterpiece that stands with the legendary battles of history. It was pure Napoleon, using deception to set the stage, concentrating his force at the perfect moment, and relying on speed, timing, and flexibility. He didn't just beat his enemies on the field, he completely outthought them, luring them into a trap so perfect they basically engineered their own destruction. The victory cemented Napoleon's power, kicking off nearly a decade of French military dominance in Europe. It shattered the Third Coalition and redrew the map of the continent. But more than that, it created a legend. The son of Austerlitz became a powerful symbol of Napoleonic glory, an almost mystical sign of his destiny. It was the ultimate gamble. Outnumbered, deep in enemy territory, Napoleon risked everything on one audacious plan. On a frozen field in Moravia, under a brilliant winter sun, that gamble delivered a victory so total that its echoes still ring through history. It was the moment Napoleon Bonaparte, the boy from Corsica, truly became the master of Europe. Title: Inside Napoleon's Greatest Gamble, The Battle of Austerlitz. December 2, 1805. A thick, frigid fog blankets the frozen fields near a small Moravian town called Austerlitz. The fate of Napoleon's brand-new empire hangs by a thread. He's outnumbered, his supply lines are stretched dangerously thin, and his enemies, the combined armies of Imperial Russia and Austria, hold the high ground. His own marshals are nervous, they are suggesting retreat. But this apparent weakness? It's all part of the plan. Napoleon has spent days meticulously luring his enemies into a trap. Now, all he needs is for the sun to burn away the mist and illuminate what would become his greatest masterpiece. He has gambled everything, and the price of failure is total annihilation. To really get why Austerlitz was such a massive gamble, we have to rewind to the autumn of 1805. The peace in Europe, which was always shaky at best, had completely shattered. Enraged by Napoleon's coronation as emperor and his growing power in Italy and Germany, the great powers of Europe had teamed up against him once again. This was the War of the Third Coalition, a heavyweight alliance of Great Britain, Austria, Russia, Sweden, and Naples, all with one goal in mind: to put the upstart emperor back in his box. Their plan was simple: overwhelm Napoleon with sheer numbers from all directions. To the south, the brilliant Austrian commander Archduke Charles was gathering 80,000 men in Italy, which the Allies figured would be the main event. To the north, a massive Russian army was marching west to join the Austrians. And across the Channel, Great Britain, the coalition's wallet, was using its naval power and deep pockets to fund the whole operation, making sure the armies marching on France were well paid and ready to fight. But Napoleon wasn't the kind of emperor to sit around and wait to be attacked. In a move that left Europe breathless, he took the entire army he'd assembled to invade England and marched it with shocking speed into the heart of Germany. This was the Grande Army *, a revolutionary new kind of fighting force. It was made of 7 self-sufficient army corps that could march and fight on their own, making it flexible, fast, and absolutely lethal. And Napoleon knew exactly how to use it. His first target was an Austrian army under General Karl Mack von Liebrich, who had marched into Bavaria. Mack made 2 mistakes that would cost him everything. He totally underestimated how fast the French could move, and he assumed the main fight would be in Italy. Instead of attacking head-on, Napoleon executed a huge, sweeping envelopment. The Grande Army marched in a great arc, cutting off Mack's supply lines and surrounding his army before he even knew what was happening. The Ulm campaign was a strategic masterpiece, and on October 20, 1805, an entire Austrian army surrendered, almost without a single major battle. With that, the road to Vienna was wide open, and French troops captured the Austrian capital in November. But this victory was a deceptive one. The main Allied force was still in the fight. The veteran Russian army, led by the wily and cautious General Mikhail Kutuzov, had managed to escape the trap at Ulm and was now linking up with other Austrian forces in Moravia. Their combined army was growing every day, soon to be almost 90,000 men strong. Worse, Archduke Charles was now marching his 80,000 men up from Italy, and Prussia was threatening to join the coalition with another 180,000 troops. Suddenly, Napoleon's situation was critical. His Grande Army, now about 73,000 strong, was deep in enemy territory, hundreds of miles from home. He was outnumbered, and the net was closing in. A single loss wouldn't just be a lost battle. It would be the end of his army and his empire. He needed a victory, and he needed it now. He needed one sharp blow to end the war. But he knew he couldn't attack the Allies with their superior numbers. No, he'd have to make them attack him on ground he had chosen and in a way of his own design. He would have to set the perfect trap. The battlefield Napoleon chose was an area he had studied with obsessive detail days before. It was a landscape of rolling hills and marshy streams, but two features were key: Santon Hill, a lone peak on the north end of his line which he promptly fortified, and the star of the show, the Pratzen Heights, a broad plateau that dominated the center of the field. He told his marshals, "Gentlemen, examine this ground carefully. It is going to be a battlefield. You will have a part to play upon it." Then, the mind games began. Napoleon launched a campaign of psychological warfare to make the French army look weak, anxious, and desperate for peace. He sent his aide to the Allied headquarters with offers of an armistice, a move so out of character for him that it made the Allied commanders first suspicious and then dangerously arrogant. He followed this up by requesting a personal meeting with Tsar Alexander I. The young Tsar refused but sent his incredibly smug aide, Prince Peter Dolgorukov, instead. The meeting was pure theater. Napoleon intentionally acted hesitant and worried. Dolgorukov fell for it completely, reporting back that the French army was on its last legs and that victory was a sure thing. The physical deception was even bolder. As the Allies advanced, Napoleon ordered his troops to abandon the dominant Pratzen Heights. And not just withdraw, but to do it looking like a chaotic, panicked retreat. To any conventional military mind, giving up the high ground was pure insanity. To the Allied command, it was the final proof that the French were beaten. They eagerly occupied the very ground Napoleon had gifted them, thinking they now held the key to victory. The final piece of the ruse was the riskiest. Napoleon deliberately weakened his own right flank, anchored by the villages of Telnitz and Sokolnitz. This was his connection to Vienna, his only line of retreat. By leaving it so obviously undermanned, he presented a target the Allies simply couldn't resist. He was baiting them, daring them to throw their main force at this flank to cut him off from Vienna and destroy his army. It was an enormous risk. If that flank broke too early, his army would be annihilated. Everything now depended on two things: the Allies taking the bait, and the timely arrival of his secret weapon. Unbeknownst to the Allies, Napoleon had ordered the Three Corps, under his toughest and most tenacious marshal, Louis-Nicolas Davout, on a brutal forced march from Vienna. Davout's men had to cover nearly 70 miles in just 48 hours to plug the gap on the right flank. It was a desperate race against time. With the stage set and the trap baited, all Napoleon could do was wait. On the evening of December 1st, the Allied Command Council met to finalize their plan of attack. The mood was one of supreme confidence. Presiding were two emperors, the 28-year-old Tsar Alexander I of Russia and Holy Roman Emperor Francis I of Austria. While Francis was hesitant, the young Tsar, surrounded by equally young and aggressive nobles, was spoiling for a fight. He'd never seen combat and was hungry for glory. The veteran Russian general Kutuzov, however, was deeply uneasy. He knew just how dangerous it was to underestimate Napoleon and argued for caution. He wanted to retreat even further, stretching French supply lines to the breaking point. At Galicia, he famously planned, "I will bury the French." But the Tsar and his hot-headed friends waved off the old general's warnings as cowardice. The pressure to attack was just too great. In the end, Tsar Alexander sidelined Kutuzov and officially adopted a plan cooked up by the Austrian Chief of Staff, General Franz von Weyrother. Weyrother, despite a track record that included planning other disastrous defeats, was certain he had devised the perfect strategy. He read his plan aloud in a long, tedious monologue that had some of the generals literally falling asleep. The plan was exactly what Napoleon had been hoping for. It was complicated, depended on perfect timing, and, most importantly, it focused almost entirely on what they thought was the weak French right flank. Weyrather's grand idea was for the bulk of the Allied army, some 59,000 men in 3 massive columns, to descend from the Pratzen Heights, smash through Telnitz and Sokolnitz, and sweep north to roll up the entire French line. Another column would advance across the center, while General Pyotr Bagration's 13,000 men would create a diversion on the Allied right. In reserve was the pride of the Russian army, the 8,500 soldiers of the Imperial Guard, led by the Tsar's brother, Grand Duke Constantine. The plan was fatally flawed from the start. It was based on the false belief that the French were weak and about to retreat. It sent most of the Allied army into a clumsy attack on difficult, marshy ground, and in doing so, it dangerously weakened their own center on the Pratzen Heights. As they marched down from the plateau, their flank would be completely exposed. Kutuzov saw the disaster coming. Pointing to the heights, he knew that whoever held that ground would control the battle. But the Tsar wouldn't listen. As the meeting broke up, a disgusted Kutuzov was heard to mutter, "The battle is lost." Then he fell asleep. As night fell on December 1st, the Allied army began the slow, cumbersome process of moving into position, confident in their plan. Napoleon, by contrast, was perfectly calm. During his supper, he got the news he'd been waiting for. Marshal Davout and his exhausted 3 corps had made it. They were battered from their forced march, but they were in position. The southern flank would hold. The trap was complete. That evening, Napoleon issued one of his most famous proclamations. It was a masterpiece of motivation, read to his troops by candlelight. "Soldiers," it began, "the Russian army has presented itself before you to revenge the disasters of the Austrians at Ulm. The positions which we occupy are formidable. While they are marching to turn my right, they must present their flank to your blows." He laid out the entire plan for every soldier, trusting them completely. Then he made a promise, "I will myself direct all your battalions. I will keep myself at a distance from the fire, if, with your accustomed valor, you carry disorder and confusion into the enemy's ranks. But should victory appear for a moment uncertain, you will see your emperor expose himself to the first strokes." Later, Napoleon decided to tour the front lines himself. As he moved through the camps, he was recognized. One soldier, wanting to light the emperor's way, tied a bundle of straw to his musket and lit it like a torch. The idea caught on. In a spontaneous wave of loyalty, thousands of soldiers did the same. The entire French line erupted in a blaze of torchlight, the men cheering "Vive l'Empereur" to celebrate the first anniversary of his coronation. From their perch on the Pratzen Heights, the Allied commanders looked down at the show. They fatally misinterpreted it, believing the French were burning their camps before a pre-dawn retreat. It only strengthened their resolve to attack. For Napoleon, the moment was profound. It was proof of the incredible bond he shared with his men. He returned to his command post, knowing they would not fail him. He had surveyed the terrain, devised the plan, manipulated his enemies, and inspired his men. The rest was up to the fog, the sun, and the courage of his soldiers. At 4 a.m., Napoleon held a final conference with his marshals. Everyone knew their part. In the south, General Legrand's division, backed by Davout's newly arrived but exhausted men, had the toughest job: hold the French right flank against the main Allied attack. They were the bait, the anvil on which the Allied army would be smashed. Their job wasn't to win, but to hold on, bleed the enemy, and suck as many Allied troops as possible into the fight for the villages of Telnitz and Sokolnitz. The Hammer, 2 divisions of Marshal Soult's corps, waited silently in the low ground, hidden by the thick morning mist. Just after 7 a.m., the battle began. The first massive Allied column started their descent from the Pratzen Heights, their movements cloaked in the same fog that hid the French. The fight for the southern villages turned into a brutal, grinding mess. Telnitz changed hands multiple times in a chaotic swirl of bayonet charges and point-blank musketry. Sokolnitz became the absolute epicenter of the southern fight. The second and third Allied columns slammed into the French defenders, getting bogged down in a bloody brawl for control of the village and its small castle. Just as Napoleon had hoped, the Allied command, obsessed with breaking his right flank, kept pouring more and more troops down from the Pratzen Heights, convinced that victory was just one more push away. They were fatally thinning out their own center, leaving it wide open. From his command post, Napoleon watched the Allied columns vanish into the fog-filled valley. He waited, with incredible patience, for the perfect moment. Attack too soon, and the Allies wouldn't be fully committed. Attack too late, and his own right flank might collapse. Around 8:45 a.m., the sun of Austerlitz made its famous appearance. As the winter sun climbed, it began to burn away the mists, revealing the battlefield. Napoleon looked through his telescope and saw exactly what he had hoped for. The Pratzen Heights, the key to the entire battle, were now almost empty. He turned to the impatient Marshal Soult. "How long will it take for your men to reach the Pratzen Heights?" Soult replied, "Less than 20 minutes, sire." Napoleon waited for one final quarter of an hour, letting the last enemy units march off the plateau. Then he gave the order. "One sharp blow," he declared, "and the war is over." At 9 a.m., 16,000 men from Soult's corps surged out of the mist like ghosts. Their sudden appearance on the sunlit slopes of the Pratzen absolutely shocked the Allied commanders. General Kutuzov, who was with the 4th Allied column, was caught completely by surprise as the French slammed into his flank. The French division smashed into the column, shattering it and sending it reeling. The fighting on the heights was ferocious, but by midday the French were in complete control. The Allied army had been cut in two. Napoleon, his plan a perfect success, moved his command post to a chapel on the Pratzen Heights to direct the final act. While the main event was happening on the heights, fierce fighting was also raging on the northern flank. There, Marshal Lanz's V Corps and Murat's cavalry held off the Russian corps of Prince Bagration. Lanz's infantry and Murat's horsemen didn't just hold their ground, they steadily pushed the Allied right wing back, cutting off one of their main escape routes. Back on the Pratzen, the Allies made one last, desperate gamble. Grand Duke Constantine, seeing the center collapsing, threw in his elite reserve, the Russian Imperial Guard. These giant, elite soldiers launched a ferocious counterattack and, for a moment, the French line wavered. One French battalion broke and fled, losing its eagle, the only French standard lost that day. Sensing the crisis, Napoleon unleashed his own ultimate weapon, the French Imperial Guard. The elite chasseurs and grenadiers of the Guard thundered forward to meet their Russian counterparts. What followed was one of the most famous cavalry clashes of the age. Napoleon's aide, General Rapp, led a final, decisive charge that shattered the Russian Imperial Guard. The Allied center hadn't just been broken, it had been erased. With the Pratzen Heights lost and the Imperial Guard defeated, the Allied army simply disintegrated. The right wing under Bagration, seeing the battle was lost, managed an orderly retreat. But for the three huge columns trapped in the valley to the south, there was no escape. Their situation was a nightmare. They were caught between Davout's corps in front and Soult's victorious troops descending from the heights behind them. Panic set in. The organized columns dissolved into a terrified mob. Thousands of fleeing soldiers ran for the frozen ponds of Sachin and Menitz, hoping to escape across the ice. Napoleon, watching from the heights, ordered his artillery to fire, not at the men, but at the ice itself. Cannonballs shattered the frozen surface. The legend that followed claimed thousands of men drowned in the icy water. In reality, the toll was much lower. When the lakes were drained a few days later, the bodies of only 2 or 3 men and about 150 horses were found. The story was great propaganda, but the real catastrophe was the utter collapse of the Allied left wing, which was now trapped and forced to surrender in droves. The rout was total. Tsar Alexander himself was seen fleeing the battlefield in tears. The scale of the victory was staggering. The Allies suffered roughly 16,000 killed or wounded, with another 11,000 captured. The French, by contrast, lost around 8,000 to 9,000 men. Napoleon's army had also captured 180 cannons and 45 enemy standards. The gamble had paid off more spectacularly than anyone could have imagined. 2 days after the battle, a humbled Emperor Francis of Austria met with Napoleon to arrange an armistice. The war of the Third Coalition was over. The Russians were allowed to retreat, a deal Tsar Alexander only secured by lying that an armistice was already in place. For Austria, though, the price of peace was brutal. The Treaty of Pressburg, signed on December 26, 1805, was crushing. Austria had to give up huge territories in Italy and Germany, pay a massive indemnity of 40 million francs, and recognize Napoleon's new European order. The treaty's most dramatic consequence came the following year. In August 1806, Francis II formally dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, an institution that had existed for 1,000 years, in part to prevent Napoleon from claiming the title for himself. In its place, Napoleon created the French-controlled Confederation of the Rhine. To his own men, Napoleon was full of praise. In a proclamation the day after the battle, he celebrated their courage. "Soldiers, I am pleased with you," he began. "You have decked your eagles with a glory that shall never die." He ended with a promise that would define the legend of his veterans: "My people will welcome you back with delight, and all you will have to say is, 'I was at the Battle of Austerlitz,' for them to reply, 'There goes a brave man.'" The story of Austerlitz is more than just a battle, it's a masterclass in strategy, deception, and leadership. If you want more stories about the tactics and personalities that shaped history, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And tell us in the comments, what other historical gambles completely changed the game? We read every single one. For those who want to support the channel directly, think about joining our Patreon, where you'll get access to exclusive content and a look behind the scenes.